Ignore. Chapter 9, The Sowing of the Seeds. As Rhaenyra's cause suffered devastating losses, particularly after the death of Meleys, one of her strongest dragons, her son Jacaerys understood that raw courage alone would never be enough to win the war. They needed more riders, they needed more dragons, and the only dragons left available were the ones that had never known a master at all. What followed became known as the Sowing of the Seeds, a radical, almost heretical departure from everything the Targaryens had believed for thousands of years. For as long as anyone could remember, the bond between dragon and rider had been treated as a sacred blood-bound mystery, reserved exclusively for the purest Valyrian lineage. Suggesting that a commoner might mount a dragon had always been treated as something close to sacrilege. Jacaerys had no patience left for that taboo. He sent word across the Crownlands. Any man or woman with the courage to try could attempt to claim one of the riderless dragons of Dragonmont. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of hopefuls, blacksmiths, farmers, sellswords, vagabonds, and outright fools flocked to Dragonstone, all of them now labeled dragon seeds, a term once reserved specifically for bastard children of Targaryen blood, now applied to anyone with even a rumored drop of Valyrian ancestry, or simply a reckless enough heart to try regardless. The process itself was brutally simple. Each seed would be led into the caverns of Dragonmont and given a single chance to approach one of the sleeping or wild dragons, speak to it, and hope to be accepted. If the dragon allowed it, they lived and gained one of the greatest prizes imaginable. If not, they died, often instantly, often horribly. The death toll was genuinely staggering. The cannibal killed every single person who approached him without exception, his black shape erupting from the shadows before his would-be riders could even scream. The gray ghost simply vanished deeper into the tunnels, leaving pursuers lost, exhausted, and terrified in the volcanic heat. But for those who succeeded, the reward was extraordinary. The first to triumph was a man named Adam of Hull, rumored though never confirmed to be the illegitimate son of Lord Corlys Velaryon. Adam had grown up around the docks, entirely a commoner by upbringing, yet when he walked into the lair of Seasmoke, riderless since Leaner's disappearance, the silver-scaled dragon lowered his head and allowed Adam to climb onto his back without incident. A commoner with no noble name to his credit had claimed one of the most capable dragons in the realm. Shortly after came Hugh Hammer, a blacksmith from King's Landing with no known claim to Valyrian blood whatsoever. He walked into Dragonmont and approached Vermithor the Bronze Fury, once ridden by Jaehaerys himself, unridden for decades and widely assumed to be unclaimable by anyone new. Hugh approached him without visible fear, and the ancient bronze dragon, perhaps sensing something in the man's resolve, lowered his head in acceptance. A common blacksmith had become rider to one of the largest dragons alive. Silverwing, too, was soon claimed by another new rider, further strengthening Rhaenyra's dwindling forces. These successes came at a staggering cost. For every Adam or Hugh who succeeded, dozens more perished, and the ground of Dragonmont grew littered with the charred remains of the unlucky and the overly ambitious. But for Rhaenyra's cause, it was a gamble worth taking. With Vermithor and Seasmoke now added to her side, the balance of power that Aemond's claiming of Vhagar had tipped so decisively toward the Greens was, for the moment, at least partially restored. The sowing of the seeds was more than simple military necessity, though. It was a genuine cultural earthquake. For thousands of years, the Targaryens had maintained their authority partly through the belief that dragon riding was tied inseparably to noble Valyrian blood, a divine right passed down through bloodline alone. By opening the skies to absolutely anyone willing to risk their life for the chance, Jacaerys hadn't just found desperately needed new riders. He had cracked, perhaps permanently, the mystique that had made his family feel untouchable. A blacksmith now rode a dragon that had once carried a king. For the old nobility, that was terrifying. For the small folk, it was, however briefly, a glimpse of a world where power didn't have to be inherited. Chapter 10, The War Turns to Fang and Fire. The first true instance of dragon-on-dragon violence in generations came not on any grand battlefield, but during what began as a simple diplomatic errand. Lucerys Velaryon, barely 14 years old, flew his small dragon Arax to the storm-battered fortress of Lord Boros Baratheon, carrying a message from his mother, Rhaenyra, asking the Stormlands to honor their old oaths of support. The Greens, however, had sent their own representative, Aemond Targaryen, mounted on the colossal Vhagar. When Lucerys arrived, he found himself effectively cornered. Boros refused to firmly commit to either side, but Aemond's presence alone was a threat that couldn't be ignored. Aemond demanded a literal eye for an eye, referencing an old injury Lucerys' brother had once caused him. When the frightened boy refused and fled the hall into the storm outside, launching Arax into the black, rain-soaked sky in hopes of simply outrunning his pursuer, Aemond followed, goaded by fury and by the encouragement of the War Council waiting back home. What happened over Shipbreaker Bay that night has echoed through the story ever since. Arax was small, fast, and agile. Vhagar was a living mountain, her wingspan blotting out even the lightning overhead. Lucerys tried desperately to climb above the storm clouds to escape, but Aemond pushed Vhagar higher and faster, closing the gap. When Arax finally turned in a last, desperate act of defiance and tried to breathe fire, Vhagar simply snapped her jaws shut around the smaller dragon and crushed him midair. Lucerys and Arax both fell into the churning sea below, neither body was ever recovered. That single death changed the entire tone of the war. It hadn't been a battle, it had been closer to an execution, and it proved definitively that even the mightiest dragons could be killed by their own kind. The old assumption that dragons were simply untouchable, invincible superweapons shattered that night for good. Both sides now understood that the next time dragons met in the sky, there would be no mercy and no restraint, only a brutal, potentially mutual annihilation. The next major confrontation came at Rook's Rest, a small coastal castle in the Crownlands. Rhaenys Targaryen, sometimes called the Queen Who Never Was, rode her swift pink and silver dragon Melis, known as the Queen of Dragons, to relieve a besieged garrison there. But the Greens had prepared a trap. Aegon II on his golden dragon Sunfyre and Aemond on Vhagar waited in ambush, with Vhagar's massive bulk deliberately hidden behind a ridge until the fighting was already underway. When Melis and Sunfyre engaged directly, tearing at one another in a furious mid-air duel, Vhagar struck from above in a devastating surprise attack that caught both combatants off guard. The three dragons became a tangled, screaming knot of violence. Sunfyre, broken and badly wounded, could barely stay airborne. Melis fought fiercely, tearing at Vhagar's neck, but was hopelessly outmatched in size and raw strength. Rhaenys fought until the very end, but Melis was ultimately overwhelmed and killed, taking her rider down with her in the flames. Aegon himself survived the encounter but was horribly burned and permanently crippled. The cost of that single battle was staggering. One great dragon lost outright, another crippled beyond recovery, and the war pushed decisively into a far more savage phase. The realization that dragons could be maimed or killed by their own kind spread through both camps like a fever. Neither side could afford to treat their dragons as guaranteed trump cards any longer. Every flight into battle now carried a very real risk of losing everything in a single stroke, a grim, aerial version of mutually assured destruction, where the only realistic strategy left was to strike first, strike hard, and hope your own dragons survived the exchange. Chapter 11: The Long Quiet Extinction. The war continued to grind on, and dragons kept dying in the process. Prince Jacaerys and his dragon Vermax were shot out of the sky by enemy archers at the Battle of the Gullet. The wild dragon Sheepstealer, newly claimed, was badly wounded during the First Battle of Tumbleton, though he survived. Each new engagement left fewer dragons standing than the one before it, and there was simply no way to replace them quickly. This is really the heart of the tragedy worth sitting with. The decline wasn't just about numbers, it was about the unraveling of centuries of irreplaceable knowledge. For thousands of years, the Valyrian dragon lords had maintained secret, sacred traditions around hatching and raising dragons, arcane practices passed down through bloodlines and oral tradition rather than written texts. That knowledge had never been recorded in any book a scholar could simply pick up and study. It lived entirely within the people who carried it, generation to generation. When the Targaryens fled the doom of Valyria, they brought with them only a handful of dragons, and it turns out, only a fraction of that deeper knowledge. They understood how to bond with dragons they already had, and they had a rough sense of how to properly care for eggs that were already viable. But the deeper secrets, the specific rituals, the ancient practices that might have allowed them to call new dragons into being more reliably, those had already begun slipping away even before the dance of the dragons began. Then the war arrived, and with every rider who died, another piece of that residual knowledge vanished forever. The riders themselves had been the last living keepers of the bond, the ones who understood how to calm a restless dragon, how to properly feed and raise a young one, how to recognize the earliest signs of illness. All of it had been passed down as oral tradition, parent to child, rider to rider. When the riders started killing each other in earnest, that fragile chain of knowledge simply shattered. The aftermath tells its own story. After the dance ended, the Targaryens still technically had dragons, but they were smaller, weaker, and increasingly stunted compared to their magnificent predecessors. The truly great beasts, Vhagar and Vermithor among them, were gone, and the dragons hatched in the decades that followed were mere shadows of what had come before. Some eggs never hatched at all. Others produced creatures barely larger than a horse, with thin, undersized wings and scales lacking any of the old luster. They were sickly, prone to disease, and many died young, not from any natural process of decline, but from a genuine catastrophe born of lost knowledge. By the reign of King Aegon III, remembered, sadly as the Dragonbane, not because he hated dragons but because he had personally witnessed the horror of the war and watched the last truly significant dragon die on his watch, the once thriving Targaryen dragon population had dwindled to a handful of pitiful, sickly specimens. The very last dragon of any real significance was reportedly a small green creature, no larger than a house cat when it hatched. It lived only a few years, growing slowly and weakly, and never developed the ability to fly or breathe anything more than a faint flicker of flame. When it finally died, the dynasty was left with no living dragons at all, only cold, dormant eggs stored away in the crypts of Dragonstone, eggs no one alive still knew how to wake. Without dragons, the Targaryens were in practical terms reduced to just another noble family, one with a long and storied history certainly, but no longer able to intimidate rivals from the sky or enforce their will with fire. The great houses of Westeros slowly began testing boundaries that would once have been unthinkable, and the crown had little left to answer with beyond plots, marriages, and careful political maneuvering. If the notoriously unstable King Aerys II had possessed even a single living dragon of modest size during Robert's rebellion, that entire conflict might have unfolded very differently. Instead, he had only wildfire, and it ultimately turned against him and his dynasty. The Targaryens had become, in the truest sense, ordinary mortals, as vulnerable to sword and arrow as anyone else. Chapter 12, Clearing Up a Few Myths. Before we close this chapter of the story, it's worth pausing to correct a couple of persistent misconceptions that tend to cling to Targaryen lore. First, Balerion was not alive during the events of House of the Dragon, despite how often that assumption comes up. By the time Viserys sits the Iron Throne, Balerion has already been dead for decades. He died of old age roughly 94 years after the conquest, during Jaehaerys' reign at somewhere around 200 years old. His skull in the Red Keep is a monument to a bygone era, and the dragons we actually follow in this story, Vhagar, Vermithor, Meleys, Syrax, are echoes of that original greatness, not direct continuations of it. Vhagar comes closest, having been born just 12 years after the conquest and grown, by the time of the dance, to a size nearly rivaling Balerion's own prime. But she is not him, and that distinction matters because the tragedy of the dance isn't simply a civil war between two rival factions. It's the story of an entire species already in decline, long before the first arrow was ever loosed at Storm's End. Second, it's worth resisting the temptation to reduce these creatures to simple mindless weapons, fire-breathing siege engines with scales and nothing more. That view genuinely undersells them. Dragons throughout the story display cunning, willfulness, and something very close to complex emotion and strategic reasoning. Vhagar's ambush at Rook's Rest wasn't a blind charge. It was a calculated, predatory strike guided by both instinct and rider intent. The bond between dragon and rider isn't simple training, it's closer to a mystical union forged in blood, and the dragons within it seem genuinely capable of knowing and mourning their riders. When the wild dragons of Dragonmont were offered potential riders during the sowing of the seeds, they didn't accept indiscriminately, they tested, they rejected, and in the cannibals' case, they killed without hesitation. That's not the behavior of a mindless beast. It's the behavior of a creature with genuine agency, pride, and a clear sense of self. Perhaps the Targaryens' deepest and most fatal mistake was treating dragons purely as tools of power, when in truth they had always been something closer to partners, and, on occasion, judges. Chapter 13, What the Dragons Leave Behind. All of which brings us to the deeper, more symbolic truth sitting underneath this entire saga. The death of the dragons was never simply a military or political event. It was, in a very real sense, the death of magic itself in Westeros. The Targaryens' arrival 2 centuries before the dance had brought with it an age of genuine wonder, fire capable of melting stone, flight that defied every law men understood, creatures that made an entire family feel closer to gods than to ordinary mortals. But that magic had never been built to last forever. It depended entirely on a fragile balance. The old blood of Valyria, ancient rights nearly lost even before the doom, and a living, breathing connection to fire that couldn't simply be replicated through effort or ambition alone. When the dragons began dying in the dance, they took that fragile magic down with them. Hatching viable new eggs became nearly impossible. The old bonds that had once linked rider to dragon so seamlessly faded as bloodlines thinned and knowledge disappeared. By the time the very last, sickly dragon died in the year 153 after the conquest, the entire atmosphere of the world seemed to shift. The long, blessed summers of the early Targaryen reign gave way to harsher winters. The old superstitions of the small folk curdled into cynicism. The Meisters, who had long resented the influence of sorcery over their more rational approach to history, began quietly rewriting the historical record in a new key, one that increasingly denied the old powers had ever truly existed. The world became more ordinary, more rational, and in some important sense more brittle. And in that brittleness lay the seeds of everything darker that would follow generations later: the War of the Five Kings, the horrors of the Long Night, all of it, 3 centuries down the line. But the story of the dragons doesn't quite end there. Its echoes eventually find their way to a young exiled girl sold across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen. The fracturing of the dynasty, the slaughter of the dragons, the betrayal within the family itself, all of it sets the stage for her eventual arrival, and for the reawakening of a magic everyone had assumed was permanently extinguished. When Daenerys walks into Khal Drogo's funeral pyre and emerges with 3 living hatchlings, she isn't simply performing a dramatic ritual. In a very real sense, she's rewriting an ancient covenant that had been broken for nearly 2 centuries, becoming an echo of those first Valyrian dragon lords who discovered fire and blood magic in the shadow of the 14 Fires. But her dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, also carry within them the final unresolved tragedy of the entire Targaryen story. The lesson of the dance, the one lesson no one before her ever truly learned, that dragons are not meant to be tamed purely by human ambition. They are forces of nature, as indifferent as a storm and as dangerous as any volcano. That cycle, it seems, is never quite broken, only ever repeated in a slightly different key. Chapter 14: The True Protagonists. So let's consider for a moment who the real center of this entire Targaryen tragedy has always been. Not the kings and queens, not the princes and princesses scheming for a throne, not the soldiers or the court advisors whispering in shadowed halls. The dragons themselves are the true beating heart of this story. They are symbols of power, certainly, but they're also symbols of connection, each one carrying in some sense the memory of the rider bonded to them, and the history of an entire family held together, however imperfectly, by fire and blood. Vhagar, ancient and unmatched, embodies the sheer weight of legacy passed down across 2 centuries. Syrax, golden and fiercely loved, reflects the devotion of a mother who would risk absolutely everything for her children. Caraxes, the bloodworm, carries the restless fury of a prince who never quite found peace with himself. Sunfyre, beautiful and ultimately doomed, mirrors a king who chose vanity over wisdom at the worst possible moment. And the Wild Ones, the cannibal, sheepstealer, and the Grey Ghost, represent the untamed forces the Targaryens, for all their ancient magic and inherited pride, could never fully bring under their control. When the dragons died, the Targaryens lost far more than a simple military advantage. They lost something closer to their soul. The Dance of the Dragons was never really a war for a throne, it was a war for the identity of an entire dynasty, and in that war, in the end, absolutely everyone lost something they could never quite get back. Closing. And so we arrive at the end of this long journey through scale and flame, from the smoking peaks of the 14 Fires, all the way through the ashes of a civil war that nearly ended a dynasty entirely. We've watched hatchlings grow into titans. We've watched bonds forged in cradles and shattered over open water. We've mourned Arax and Melis, and so many others whose names barely survive as footnotes. Perhaps more clearly than the characters living through it themselves, we can now see that the true tragedy of House of the Dragon was never really about who sat the Iron Throne. It was about the slow extinction of wonder, the quiet, irreversible death of magic, and the gradual forgetting of what it once meant to feel truly alive in a world still touched by fire. The dragons were never simply a backdrop to the Targaryen story, they were the story. Without them, the family is just another line of ambitious, fragile humans, no different in the end from anyone else who has ever reached for a crown. So as you settle in tonight, consider for a moment the weight of those enormous wings, the glint of moonlight catching on old bronze scale, the low, contented rumble of a beast curled protectively around the person it loves. These are the images worth carrying with you long after the names and dates have faded from memory. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey tonight. If you're drifting off now, know you're in good company. The dragons, wherever they are dreaming too, and their dreams belong to an age that never quite finishes dying. Good night, and may your own fire burn quietly wherever you keep it. Every dragon in House of the Dragon, the complete history. Tonight, we're going to sit with the full story of every dragon that ever mattered to House Targaryen. There's a lot of ground to cover, so let's take it slow, chapter by chapter, the way we always do. If you're here to drift off tonight, just let the words carry you along. If this is your first night with us, welcome, settle in, and let's begin. Chapter 1: The Heat Before the Throne. Before there was an Iron Throne, before there was a King's Landing, before anyone had ever heard the name Targaryen, there was heat. Not the ordinary warmth of a hearth or a summer afternoon, but something deeper, a heat that lived in the marrow of the world itself, waiting to be found. To understand where the dragons came from, we have to go back nearly 5,000 years, long before Aegon the Conqueror ever looked toward the shores of Westeros and imagined a single crown ruling it all. We have to travel east, to a peninsula that once stood at the center of the known world, Valyria. Picture a jagged horizon broken by 14 volcanic peaks, each one venting ash into a sky stained violet and orange, each one spilling rivers of molten stone down into the valleys below. The locals called them the 14 Fires, and for generations they were simply a fact of life, dangerous, unpredictable but survivable, the way any mountain range with a temper can be survived if you respect it. It was here, in the shadow of those fires, that a group of ordinary shepherds made a discovery that would reshape the world. Tending their flocks near the smoking vents, they found something living in the heat, coiled in nests among the volcanic rock, scales gleaming faintly even in darkness. Dragons. These were not the disciplined, rideable creatures we associate with later Targaryen history. These were wild, primordial things born as much from magic as from flesh and bone. No rope could hold them. No whip could command them. Traditional domestication, the kind used to break a horse or train a hunting hound, was worthless here. The Valyrians understood almost immediately that if they wanted these creatures, they would need something else entirely. What exactly happened next is one of history's genuine mysteries. We don't have a clean record of how a handful of shepherds transformed into the most powerful sorcerer lords the world had ever seen. But we know it involved blood. We know it involved magic, old, dangerous, half-forgotten rituals whispered in the shadow of the volcanoes, rites that may have involved mixing bloodlines, sacrifice, and incantation. Somehow, through that blood magic, the Valyrians forged bonds with these wild creatures that went far beyond taming. When a dragon lord took to the sky for the first time, he wasn't simply sitting atop a beast the way a man sits atop a horse. He was feeling the wind pull against leathery wings that weren't his own. He was feeling fire building in a chest that wasn't his chest. Rider and dragon became, in some very real sense, two halves of a single soul. That bond, mystical, blood-bound, and utterly unique to Valyrian bloodlines, is the foundation of everything that follows in this story. Not every Valyrian could forge that bond, even within the ruling families. The gift was rare, guarded jealously, and never shared outside the noble houses who discovered it. To ride a dragon required more than courage. It required a lineage soaked in what the Valyrians called the old blood, a hereditary capacity to survive the mental and spiritual merging that came when a person and a dragon became linked. With dragons at their command, the Valyrian freehold became something the world had never seen, an empire built on absolute aerial supremacy. They could burn down any army that opposed them, raise any fortress that resisted, and expand their borders faster than any civilization in history. Cities rose, roads were carved across continents, tribute flowed in from distant, terrified nations. For thousands of years, 5,000 years, in fact, Valyria stood as the unquestioned center of civilization, and the dragon lords who ruled it treated their power as something close to eternal. It wasn't. Chapter 2: The Doom. Power built on volcanoes is never as stable as it looks, no matter how many centuries it holds. The 14 fires that had given birth to Valyrian dragons, that had heated the forges of their greatest cities, that had rumbled quietly in the background of Valyrian life for 5,000 years, had never truly been tamed. They had only been sleeping. And then, in what modern histories simply call the doom of Valyria, they woke all at once. It wasn't a single explosion you could point to on a timeline. It was closer to a symphony of destruction that unfolded over hours, perhaps days. The ground split open beneath the greatest cities in the world. Ash turned the sky black at midday. All 14 volcanoes erupted in a chain reaction that no one alive had ever imagined possible, sending molten rock pouring through streets that had stood unbothered for millennia. Temples collapsed. Palaces that had survived 1,000 years of history were simply swallowed. And in the chaos, the dragon lords, the sorcerer kings who had ruled through the mightiest weapons the world had ever known, died by the thousands, unable to outrun a disaster their own magic had, in some indirect way, helped provoke. The scale of loss is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Every great Valyrian house, every noble bloodline that had bred and bonded with dragons for 5,000 years was wiped out in what amounted to a single catastrophic afternoon. Dragons died alongside their masters, roasted in their lairs, consumed mid-flight, drowned when tidal waves swept over coastal breeding grounds. The sea itself reportedly boiled. Any ship that tried to flee the coast either burned in the blast or was capsized by monstrous waves. The air became poison for anyone who breathed it too close to the ruin. And yet against every odd, one family survived. 12 years before the doom, a young Valyrian lord named Aemond Targaryen had received a warning, a dream, a prophecy, or perhaps simply a very grim calculation whispered to him by the blood mages he kept close. Whatever the source, Aemond became utterly convinced that Valyria's destruction was coming and coming soon. This wasn't a popular belief. The Targaryens were, at the time, a relatively minor house among the Dragon Lords, not among the wealthiest or most powerful families, and their warnings were met largely with mockery from families who considered themselves untouchable. Aemond didn't care. He gathered his wives, his children, his household, and everything of value he could carry, loaded it all onto ships, and sailed west, away from the heart of the Empire, away from the 14 Fires, away from everything his people had built for 5,000 years. He took 5 dragons with him. Not the largest, not the fiercest dragons in Valyria's arsenal, but enough. Among them was Balerion, along with a dragon that would one day be known as Vhagar and Meraxes, and 2 others whose names have been lost entirely to history. They settled on a cold, damp, volcanic island off the western coast of a continent most Valyrians had never bothered to conquer, an island called Dragonstone. And there from across the narrow sea the Targaryens watched their homeland die. They felt the tremors even at that distance. They saw the horizon glow red at night. They heard, or imagined they heard, the roar of an entire civilization ending. Every family that had laughed at Aemond's fear was gone. His vision had been true, and his family alone remained. But survival came at a steep price. The dragons the Targaryens had brought with them were now the only dragons left anywhere in the known world. An entire species that had once flourished across an empire was suddenly reduced to a handful of individuals on a single small island, forced to breed within an extremely limited gene pool. For a time, the Targaryens genuinely feared their dragons would simply fade out of existence. They devoted themselves to preserving every egg, encouraging mating wherever possible, protecting every hatchling as though it were a member of the family, which, in a way, it was. Slowly, painstakingly, it worked. The dragons endured. The Targaryens, almost by accident, became the sole custodians of the most dangerous weapon the world had ever produced, not because they had sought that power, but because they alone had survived to inherit it. For over a century they stayed quiet on Dragonstone. They didn't conquer. They didn't interfere with the divided kingdoms of Westeros across the water. They simply existed, preserving what remained of their Valyrian heritage, including the old tradition of marrying within the family to keep the bloodline. And the magic tied to it as pure as possible. That quiet couldn't last forever. Eventually, Aemond's great-grandson would look across the narrow sea and see a fractured, war-torn continent ripe for the taking. He would climb onto the back of the largest dragon the world had ever known, and he would change everything. Chapter 3: Aegon's Conquest and the Forging of the Iron Throne. Aemond Targaryen was not, by most accounts, a man born purely for conquest. He was a man who had seen a vision of peace enforced by the simple, undeniable shadow of dragon wings. One continent, one crown, one law, instead of 7 feuding kingdoms constantly at each other's throats. The instrument of that vision was Balerion, a dragon so immense that later chroniclers struggled to describe him without sounding as though they were exaggerating for effect. His wingspan alone could blot out the sun over an entire village. His roar could reportedly be felt in castle walls a mile away. When he flew low, the wind off his wings could knock a mounted rider clean off his horse. And his fire wasn't the bright orange flame most people imagine when they picture a dragon. It was described as a thick, black, oily inferno, hot enough to melt stone and turn steel into liquid pools within seconds. Some legends even claimed he could swallow a full-grown mammoth whole. Whether or not that particular detail is exaggeration hardly matters. The point every source agrees on is that Balerion was less an animal and more a natural disaster with wings. He wasn't alone. Riding alongside him were Aegon's 2 sister wives, Visenya on Vhagar, a fierce, bronze-green dragon who would go on to become one of the largest and longest-lived dragons in Targaryen history, and Rhaenys on Meraxes, a swift, silver dragon whose speed matched her rider's sharp tongue. The conquest didn't begin with an overwhelming invasion. It began with a message. Aegon landed his forces at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, built a modest wooden fort, and sent ravens to every great lord in Westeros carrying a simple ultimatum: bend the knee or burn. Most lords refused, confident that castle walls and armies could withstand whatever this upstart Valyrian family had brought with them. Aeron the Black, lord of the newly completed Harrenhal, the largest castle ever built in Westeros, with walls so thick they seemed genuinely unbreachable, mocked Aegon's demand from behind those very walls. Aegon didn't bother breaching them. He simply flew Balerion above the tallest tower and unleashed his fire directly onto the stone. The walls that no siege engine could have cracked began to run like wax. Harren and his sons burned alive inside the fortress they believed was invincible. The message to the rest of Westeros was unmistakable. No wall, no tower, no army could stand against what was coming from the sky. Still, some refused to believe fire alone could win a war. The Lords of the Reach and the Westerlands gathered the largest combined host the continent had ever seen, some 55,000 men, under the joint command of the last King of the Rock and the King of the Reach, hoping that sheer numbers might overwhelm 3 dragons no matter how fearsome they were individually. They met Aegon's forces on an open plain that would forever after be known as the Field of Fire. What happened there was less a battle than an extermination. Balerion descended first, his shadow swallowing the front ranks of the army before a single arrow was loosed. His breath poured out like a river of black flame, turning entire formations of men into ash in seconds. Vhagar and Meraxes swept in from either flank, driving terrified soldiers into a closing trap of fire. The heat was reportedly so intense that shields ignited from 100 yards away. Horses panicked and trampled their own riders trying to flee. The dragons barely needed to land, they simply flew low, breathed, and turned an open field into a furnace. By the time the flames died down, nearly 4,000 men lay dead not from blade or arrow but from incineration. The survivors surrendered completely. Organized resistance in the south effectively ended that day. Aegon understood that conquest required more than raw destruction, it required symbols people would never forget. After the battle, he ordered the swords collected from the thousands of fallen soldiers, bent, broken, but still sharp, and had Balerion melt them together with his fire into a single, monstrous, deliberately uncomfortable seat. The Iron Throne wasn't forged by a blacksmith's careful hand, it was forged by dragonfire, and it was built to cut anyone who sat on it too casually, a permanent reminder that ruling 7 kingdoms was never meant to be easy or safe. That throne would endure for 3 centuries, long after Balerion himself had turned to bone in the crypts beneath Dragonstone. Dragons, though, are not immortal, however enormous their legend becomes. Balerion aged, he flew less, he slept more, his fire once capable of melting castle walls dimmed with the passing decades. He outlived Aegon and was claimed briefly by Aegon's son Meager, who used the aging dragon to help crush a rebellion, but by then Balerion was a shadow of what he had once been. By the reign of King Hoary's Eye, Balerion was so old his teeth had begun falling out, and he could barely lift his own weight off the ground. 94 years after the conquest, the Black Dread died quietly in his lair on Dragonstone. His skull was mounted on the walls of the Red Keep, not as a living threat anymore, but as a monument to a power that, by that point, nobody alive had actually witnessed at its peak. His death marked more than the loss of a single animal. It marked the closing of an entire age. The dragons that remained afterward were smaller, tamer, less overwhelming. Vhagar was still enormous, but she wasn't Balerion. The raw, world-ending magnitude that the Black Dread represented simply didn't exist anymore, and with his passing the dynasty began drifting, slowly and almost imperceptibly, toward the complacency that would eventually detonate into civil war. But before that reckoning, there would be a golden age first, a period when the skies over King's Landing were so full of dragons that people stopped being afraid of them at all. That, in its own quiet way, turned out to be more dangerous than any single battle. Chapter 4: The Golden Age of Ymharys. The real high point of Targaryen dragon-keeping arrived under King Ymhary's Eye, later called the Conciliator, whose reign lasted nearly 60 peaceful, prosperous years. Under his rule, the family's dragon population multiplied dramatically. Where Aegon had conquered a continent with only 3 dragons, Ymharys and his successors commanded nearly 20. The old dragon pit in King's Landing, once a modest stone enclosure, was expanded into a colossal domed amphitheater capable of comfortably housing dozens of dragons at once, bronze doors, soaring arches, deep sleeping pits carved for even the largest of the beasts. It was less a stable and more a temple, built with the confident assumption that this abundance of dragons would simply continue forever. For a time it seemed to. Dragons stopped being a novelty and became almost background noise in daily life. Farmers in the Crownlands learned to distinguish a young dragon's silhouette from an older one's purely out of habit. Children grew up with the shadows of wings passing regularly overhead. But that very familiarity bred a dangerous complacency. When dragons are everywhere, people stop fearing them the way they should. When every prince and princess in the family has one, it becomes easy to forget that the bond itself is a rare gift of ancient magic, not simply a birthright ode to anyone born with the name Targaryen. Beneath the surface of peace and prosperity, old rivalries began quietly resurfacing within the family itself. Questions about succession, about which dragon was truly mightiest, about which rider was most deserving of the throne one day. These questions mattered mostly to the family, but they were exactly the seeds that would later blossom into full civil war. It was during this era of plenty that the dragons central to our story were born, sometimes called the show generation, since these are the exact creatures depicted in House of the Dragon. Syrax, a sleek yellow dragon who would one day carry Rhaenyra, hatched roughly 101 years after Aegon's conquest. Sunfire, whose scales were often described as molten gold bright enough that kings would have traded crowns simply to watch him fly, came into the world around the same time, bonded eventually to Aegon II. Seasmoke, a silver-gray dragon belonging to Leaner Velaryon, emerged from his egg in that same fertile stretch of years. 3 dragons born within months of one another, all destined to play pivotal roles in a war none of them could have foreseen. The tradition behind these bonds was as old as Valyria itself, placing a dragon egg directly into the cradle of a newborn Targaryen child. It wasn't a guarantee; some eggs simply never hatched, turning cold and lifeless despite every care taken. But when it worked, the bond it created began before the child could even speak. The dragon would come to know its rider by scent and heartbeat before either of them fully understood what that connection meant. It was a tradition that reinforced loyalty across generations, but it also quietly reinforced something more dangerous: a belief, generation after generation, that the throne belonged to the Targaryens simply because the sky itself seemed to acknowledge their right to it. By the time Jaehaerys finally passed the crown to his grandson Viserys, the family had grown too large, its claims too numerous, and its dragons too plentiful for the old peace to hold much longer. And 2 dragons in particular, a red-scaled creature of terrible temper, and the Golden Queen who would one day fly beside him into war, were already beginning to shape the story that would tear the dynasty apart. Chapter 5: The Blood Worm and the Yellow Queen. Caraxes is unlike almost any other dragon in Targaryen history, and not simply because of his deep, blood-red hue, which certainly earned him his nickname. What truly sets him apart is his build. Where most dragons carry short, powerful necks built like battering rams, Caraxes has an unusually long, almost serpentine neck, giving him the look of something closer to a great worm out of old Valyrian legend. That unusual anatomy isn't just for appearances; it grants him extraordinary reach and agility in combat. Rather than simply charging and breathing fire head-on, Caraxes coils, strikes from unexpected angles, and twists through the air with a fluidity that makes him look less like a traditional dragon and more like a living whip. Combined with a temperament that can only be described as savage, this has made him one of the most feared mounts in all of Westeros. Part of that reputation comes from his rider. Daemon Targaryen is a man defined by restless ambition and violent impulse, and Caraxes seems in many ways to mirror him. But there's more to it than simple rider personality. Unlike the pampered dragons raised in the comfort of the capital's dragon pit, Caraxes spent years on real campaigns in the Stepstones, fighting alongside Daemon for glory and plunder. There, he learned to hunt, to kill without hesitation, and to endure genuine hardship, battle-tested in a way none of the court dragons ever were. Now contrast that with Syrax, the Yellow Queen. Her scales gleam a brilliant gold, almost like captured sunlight, and she's most often found basking comfortably in the courtyards of the Red Keep rather than facing down enemies in open war. Rhaenyra raised her from a hatchling, and the bond between them is among the deepest we see anywhere in this story. Rhaenyra reportedly speaks to her in High Valyrian with something close to maternal tenderness, and Syrax responds with a low, purring rumble more reminiscent of a great cat than a dragon. She's in many ways the ideal court dragon, beautiful, loyal, impressive at ceremonies, but that doesn't make her tame. If Rhaenyra were ever genuinely threatened, Syrax would bare her fangs without hesitation. What she lacks is real combat experience. She's never known the deprivation of a long campaign or faced an opponent of equal size and skill. Together, Caraxes and Syrax represent 2 very different philosophies of what it means to bond with a dragon, the hardened warrior and the pampered but still dangerous queen. Without both of them, Rhaenyra's claim to the throne would have had far less teeth behind it. And yet, even these 2 formidable dragons are overshadowed by a presence that looms larger than almost anything else in the entire war. A creature so ancient and so massive that she's less an animal and more a force of nature in her own right. Chapter 6: Vhagar the Living Relic. Vhagar was born on Dragonstone in the 12th year after Aegon's conquest, which alone should tell you something. She is, quite literally, older than the Iron Throne itself. She hatched from an egg carried across the narrow sea from the ruins of Valyria, back when the Targaryens who remembered the 14 fires firsthand were still alive to remember them. Her first rider was Queen Vhagar Targaryen, Aegon's fierce, warrior sister-wife, who wielded the Valyrian steel blade Darksister and rode Vhagar into the very battles that forged the Seven Kingdoms. It was Vhagar and Vhagar who flew into the impossible fortress of the Eyrie to bend House Arryn to Targaryen rule without a single sword drawn. It was Vhagar who used Vhagar to enforce the peace after the Field of Fire, circling the smoking ruins of the defeated armies as a silent warning against further resistance. Vhagar was there at the very founding of the dynasty, and she has outlived nearly every dragon from that era. Valyrian died of old age under Jaehaerys. Merax's was struck down by a stray bolt at the gates of the Eyrie, a genuine fluke that shattered the great silver dragon's skull, but Vhagar endured. She passed from Vhagar to her son Meager the Cruel, then to Balon the Brave, then to Laenor Velaryon before finally being claimed by Aemond Targaryen. By the time the Dance of the Dragons begins, Vhagar is without question the largest living dragon anywhere in the world, and when we say largest we mean it in a way that's genuinely hard to picture if you've only seen the younger dragons of this era. Caraxes, terrifying as he is, can still coil comfortably inside the dragon pit. Vhagar cannot. She's grown so massive that she has to sleep outdoors in a cavern carved directly into the volcanic rock of Dragonstone, and even there she barely fits. Her wingspan alone can blot out the sun over an entire village. When she lands, the ground genuinely trembles. When she roars, windows have been known to shatter for miles. That sheer scale gives her an almost unbeatable advantage in any aerial confrontation. No younger dragon, however brave its rider, can realistically match her raw physical power. This becomes the central brutal fact of the war once Aemond Targaryen claims her. Aemond is Viserys' second son, a sharp, ambitious, and increasingly ruthless young man who has spent his whole life in the shadow of his older half-siblings. He understands, perhaps better than anyone else in the family, that dragons are the true currency of power. When Vhagar's previous rider, Laenor Velaryon, apparently dies at Driftmark, Vhagar is left riderless. During the funeral held under moonlight on the beach with the great dragon sleeping nearby, the younger Targaryen children are all warned to keep their distance. Aemond ignores the warning. He walks alone across the sand, speaks the words of command in High Valyrian, and Vhagar wakes, her massive eye fixing on the boy standing before her. Whether out of extraordinary courage or sheer reckless desperation, it works. Vhagar accepts him, and in an instant the balance of power in the entire war shifts. The Green faction now controls the single largest weapon in the world, and Aemond, keenly aware of what he now commands, grows increasingly arrogant and dangerous. The psychological weight of that moment ripples through everything that follows. Younger riders on smaller dragons like Lucerys Velaryon on his modest dragon Arax now live with a very real, very specific fear of the sky, because if Vhagar appears, there is genuinely no outrunning her. Chapter 7: The Sleepers of Dragonmont. While Vhagar rides with Aemond across the Stormlands, two other dragons of comparable age and near-comparable power sleep undisturbed beneath the volcanic slopes of Dragonstone, in the mountain known as Dragonmont, the ancestral roost of House Targaryen. Their names still carry the weight of a golden age long past: Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, and Silverwing, the Pale Queen of the Skies. Vermithor was born 35 years after Aegon's conquest and was claimed by Prince Jaehaerys himself, long before he became the Conciliator. Under Jaehaerys' care, Vermithor grew into the second largest dragon ever known to have lived in Westeros, surpassed only by Balerion. His scales gleamed a deep burnished bronze like an ancient shield left too long near the forge, and his fire burned hot enough to melt stone outright. When Jaehaerys died at the age of 69 after decades of peace, no other Targaryen dared approach the massive, grieving beast. For years he remained chained in the dragon pit, restless and increasingly dangerous, before eventually being released into the wild reaches of Dragonstone, where he made his lair deep inside Dragonmont among the thermal vents. By the time the Dance of the Dragons begins, he's over 90 years old, a mountain of muscle and scale, magnificent and entirely riderless. Silverwing, by contrast, embodied grace rather than fury. She was the beloved mount of good Queen Alysanne, Jaehaerys' gentle and wise sisterwife, and her pale, moonlight-silver scales matched her famously docile temperament, a dragon calm enough to let children approach her, capable of landing softly enough in a courtyard to avoid cracking a single tile. When Alysanne died, Silverwing returned to Dragonmont as well, taking a cavern not far from Vermithor's, and there she too waited unclaimed for decades. Both dragons became something like local legend among the small folk of Dragonstone, a bronze streak occasionally glimpsed at dusk, a silver mist rising from the mountain at dawn. Everyone knew they were there. No one for decades had the blood or the courage to claim them. And beyond even these two ancient giants, Dragonmont held something stranger still, three fully wild dragons who had never known any rider at all. Chapter 8: The Wild Ones. Not every dragon in this story bowed to a Targaryen master. Some lived their entire lives on the volcanic slopes and in the smoking vents of Dragonstone, born in the wild, raised by no one, answering to nothing but their own hunger and instinct. Three names among them are spoken with a mixture of awe and genuine dread: the cannibal, sheepstealer, and the Grey Ghost. The cannibal is the one that haunts the darkest corners of Dragonstone folklore. He is the largest of the wild dragons, coal-black scales so dark they seem to swallow light, eyes glowing a vivid emerald green in the gloom of his lair. His reputation isn't built on any battle with knights or any conquered kingdom. It's built on something far more unsettling: he hunts and devours other dragons. Not deer, not livestock, other dragons, young or old, weak or strong, with a cold and deliberate ferocity that seems to defy everything we assume about how dragons are supposed to behave. Dragon keepers on Dragonstone tell of finding the cracked, gnawed bones of juvenile dragons near his lair on the mountain's eastern face. No one has ever actually witnessed him feeding. No Valyrian, no Targaryen, no soul of any house has ever dared attempt to claim him, and by the time our story reaches its climax, none ever will. Sheepstealer represents something almost the opposite: less horror, more exasperating inconvenience. His scales are a dull, earthy brown, and rather than terrorizing anyone, he simply developed an obsessive preference for the domesticated sheep dotting the fields of Dragonstone and nearby Cracklaw Point. He would descend from Dragonmont in near silence, snatch a single sheep, always the fattest, according to local farmers, and vanish back into the smoking vents before anyone could even raise an alarm. He isn't aggressive toward people, provided he isn't provoked. He simply doesn't care about them at all. Born around 34 years after the conquest, he's roughly 95 years old by the time of the dance, yet he's never once shown the slightest interest in a rider or the pageantry of the dragon pit, content instead to live as a solitary, mutton-loving predator. The Grey Ghost is the most elusive of the three, a pale, almost translucent creature, silver-gray like morning mist clinging to the mountainside. Smaller than the cannibal and even more reclusive than Sheepstealer, he rarely descends from the high vents, and when he does, it's for a brief, silent, solitary flight, often hugging the clouds as though trying to disappear into them. He earned his name because he's most often glimpsed only as a flicker of movement at the edge of vision, gone the instant anyone turns to look directly at him. Tracking any wild dragon through Dragonmont's superheated, labyrinthine tunnels is a genuinely dangerous fool's errand, but tracking the Grey Ghost is closer to an exercise in pure futility. He knows every crevice, every pocket of cooler air, every hidden path through the mountain. Together, these three wild dragons are a stark reminder that Targaryen mastery over dragonkind was never absolute. They weren't bred in captivity, weren't descended from carefully guarded bloodlines, and answered to no crown. And yet, as the war escalated and both factions desperately needed more riders and more dragons, both sides would eventually be forced to turn their eyes toward the very wild they had always chosen to.